Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Knoca workshop on designing the follow-up to climate assemblies. I should start out by reminding everybody that this call is being recorded, and when we go into plenary sessions, if you don't want to be seen, please do make sure you turn your camera off. Just a bit of background on this. So we've been very concerned since the Knoca network started on the issue of what actually happens to the recommendations of climate assemblies. And one of the things that I did early on was to reach out to a bunch of people who have written guidance on how do we do good follow-up, what is the role of public administrators and other stakeholders. And it was really interesting. There was no guidance out there. There was no guidance that people could point me towards. It may be that there is, and I haven't seen it, but lots of guidance on how to run assemblies, almost no guidance on how to land those assemblies well. So the Knowledge Network has been doing a little bit of work on this over the last year or so, which I'd like to thank Frederick Lankier for doing some of the basic interviews and also helping, leading with me on producing a briefing. And about 6 weeks ago, we published the briefing on follow-up. This is based on those interviews and also on a couple of design workshops I've done, particularly with colleagues in Scotland, which we're going to be talking a bit more about. Let me just tell you a little bit about what's going to happen in this workshop. Rarely, I'm actually not going to hand over to somebody else. I'm going to give a short presentation of some of our findings and some of our ideas and some of our thoughts on how we move towards guidance. We're going to go into breakout groups to reflect. I'm then going to have a conversation with Oliver Escobar, who is Professor of Politics at the University of Edinburgh and was on the stakeholder group for the Scottish Assembly, and also Doreen Grove, who is the Director of Open Government at Scottish Government. We're going to be talking a bit about the Scottish experience because I think it's very interesting, but then broadening it out because both of them have huge background in relation to participation and deliberation more broadly. And then we're going to go into breakout into groups, a chance for you to talk about what sort of guidance we really should be putting out there. Is the sort of ideas that Knoca is talking about, are they sensible? Are they the kind of things we should be putting? What can we expect of the different actors around climate assemblies in terms of follow-up? And we'll also be asking you the question about what do we do now as a community of practice? How do we ensure that we spread good practice in relation to follow-up? And then we'll take what comes out of this process and try and redraft anything that's needed within the briefing and also move towards producing some guidance. On that note, then, I will start the presentation once I can share my screen. And if you have any comments or thoughts, please do put them in the chat. Can I just check, Morten, is that in viewing mode?
It's good.
Fantastic. So I've already talked about the background as to why the Knowledge Network is interested in this, and this is the briefing I was talking about, and this is the process we're going through in terms of confirming that briefing and moving towards guidance. And the challenge is quite simple. We have lots of evidence out there that everyday people are willing and able to produce really robust recommendations on climate policy. That comes as no surprise to pretty much anyone in this meeting. But that process of developing those recommendations is poorly integrated in decision-making, primarily by the receiving public authority, but also relevant stakeholders. So let's think a little bit about why that's the case. And I think one of the things that, this is a very simplistic diagram, but I think one of the problems here is we've just spent a lot of our capital, attention, our resources, our energy on getting that assembly to work well. How do we do the citizen engagement well? And I think what we have been lacking in is thinking about how we prepare the process at the start in order that by the time the assembly has finished, we actually have a robust process of follow-up. So I think it's partly a problem of the way, for example, funding is available in this space, whether it's from foundations or the commissioning from governments. But most of the work that we've done, and I think, to be honest, most of the academic work we've done has been focusing on the assembly itself. We've start to see some people talking about systems and the thinking about the role of assemblies within democratic systems, but it hasn't kind of got into the detail of how that integration would work to my mind. Why that failure to land? And I'm simplistically kind of pulling out three things here that I think from the work that we've done the first is that very often these assemblies are actually poorly timed or with the policy cycle. The recommendations often land at a point when the public administration or other actors are not engaged in policy development. That can be a good thing in terms of opening up spaces, but in terms of thinking about actual relationship with policy development, that can be a problem. The second, I think, is a classic problem, that there's political will to run the assemblies, but there's not always political will to deal with the assembly recommendations. So we've got to politicians are very keen to see these assemblies happening, but aren't putting the same energy, support, and capital into following up to them. And that relates to my last point, which is that we just aren't preparing, or public administrations just often aren't prepared to receive those assembly recommendations. And I've also said, obviously, other relevant stakeholders, and that's something we'll talk about. It's not just about public administration. Just a brief story to tell you. At one of the Knoca workshops we had a year or so ago, I was talking to a public administrator, and she said that for one of her colleagues, the first time she knew about the climate assembly was when the recommendations of that assembly landed on her desk. So she was completely oblivious to the assembly, and then suddenly she's asked to consider its recommendations. And not surprisingly, she wasn't entirely happy about that particular situation and was unsure about the status she should give to the assembly. And most of what I've got to say in the rest of this presentation is actually about this question about the preparation of the public administration. That isn't to say the other things aren't important. They're absolutely critical, but it's about the focus of what we're looking at today, or at least what I'm presenting, and you can take this where you want, is how do we prepare the public administration that commissions an assembly to be ready to receive its recommendations and to take them seriously within the decision-making process. I borrow this from Julia and colleagues. They wrote a really nice blog for the Foundation for Democracy and Sustainable Development, which I'll try to remember to share with people. It's linked in the document. And I've added another logic in here, actually, which is we shouldn't be surprised that there's a problem. The logics of public governance, of bureaucracy, and the logics of electoral politics are very different from the logics of deliberative democracy. They do different things, they work in different ways. And if we think about our political system, it's still trying to deal with the tension between the logic of public governance and the logic of electoral politics. That's always still in tension with each other. And at the same time, we're now hoping that this new logic of deliberative democracy will somehow be received, will always be received positively. But actually, it has its own ways, its own sort of dynamics. And I think to recognize that those dynamics are in tension is really important. There's way more to say about that, but I just want to make that point that we should recognize that there are different tensions in practice here. So the question that I'm asking, I guess, is what needs to be in place so that we can better embed recommendations from assemblies? What do we need to do? And I'm thinking about that in at least three ways. One is, what kind of structures and processes need to be in place within administrations? What do administrations need to put in place, both in terms of procedures, in terms of responsibilities, in terms of the kinds of tools they need in order that they can better integrate those recommendations within decision making? That does not mean that all recommendations get implemented. That's not what we're saying here. It's just that they are properly considered within the decision making process. I mean, for some people they should be, but I'm taking a more ecumenical approach here of saying, how do we create the conditions such that they are taken seriously? And alongside that, what kinds of structures and processes do we need to put in place to monitor and oversee that administrative action to make sure it is happening? And within those questions, what are the roles of different actors? What are the roles for assembly members? What are the roles of politicians? What are the roles of civil servants of different types? What are the roles of different stakeholders? There's lots of actors around climate assemblies that make assemblies happen. What role do those actors who have been involved in the assembly and in the startup to the assembly actually have in the follow-up process? So I've chosen within the briefing, we've chosen to look at Scotland as a case study, as a very short case study, and we've done that for a number of reasons. But for the main one is I think Scotland tried to do a lot of really interesting things in relation to follow up. I think ultimately it was not as successful as it hoped, and I think I'll mention some of those things, and Oliver and Doreen will have things to say, I know. But there are a whole series of different elements of the Scotland's Climate Assembly that I think are worth thinking about. The first is that the Assembly was a legislative requirement under the Climate Change Act, so it had to happen. And the interesting thing about the Act is it said, and the government must respond within 6 months. So there was a legislative requirement for the government to take this seriously, which meant that it had to think about, it did have to think about the processes afterward, as well as the Assembly itself. The second thing that I think Scotland did, which was really interesting, is it had this very sophisticated governance structure. It had a secretariat, which was seconded civil servants. Some of you will have met Susie Townend, who's contributed a lot to the Knowledge Network. She led the secretariat. There was a stewarding group, which Oliver was a member of, which was a multi-stakeholder body. And there was an expert group of people who gave information to who provided scientific evidence to the Assembly. Now, what normally happens when assemblies end is those governance bodies finish their work. But in Scotland, they didn't. They carried on. And I think the stewarding group and the secretariat were there for another 9 months. And what that allowed them to do was to be able to promote what had happened through the Assembly. They were actually able to use their networks within the government, within civil service, and amongst stakeholders to promote the Assembly. And I think that was a really clever move to actually keep those bodies in place. So I think that's one really interesting learning that we can have. The second is they appointed a sponsorship team, the team from the Climate Assembly Division, Climate Change Division, to actually be responsible for follow-up. And they were given that responsibility before the Assembly started. So that sponsorship team was able to follow what was happening in the Assembly and know that it was going to be responsible for what came out of it. And they played a really important role in engaging with the heads of different divisions in terms of leading the process of getting a government response to the Assembly's recommendation. Next, we actually saw ministerial support. The ministers responded very positively to the Assembly. They empowered the sponsorship team to lead the responses, and obviously there was an official response to the Assembly. There was a parliamentary plenary debate on the Assembly, which was really, really important, raised the profile. And then the committee responsible for net zero also used this input as part of its work. The Assembly members were active. The governance body, the secretariat, were very good at training the Assembly members so that they could actually go and meet with civil servants, with ministers, and actually make the case for their recommendations and work as advocates. And then, as I said, there was a government response after 6 months. And what was, I think, really interesting about the Scottish process, they followed the French, and the Assembly reconvened and reviewed what the government had said. Now, this is, for me, this is a very sophisticated set of structures, a very sophisticated administrative response. The problem was no one had really thought about what would happen after 6 months. So the government made its response, the Assembly reconvened, and at that point, the sponsorship team was dissolved, and roughly about the same time, the governance bodies actually started their work. So what Scotland had done really well was create a structure to keep attention on those on the recommendations for 6 to 7 months. But after that 6 to 7 months, the responsibility across the authority was unclear. So I think we can learn a lot from Scotland because they tried so many things, but in the end, there were some issues about the sustainability, the long-term sustainability of what happened. Just want to mention a couple of other assemblies because I think they give us some additional insights. So Ireland is really interesting because in Scotland, Parliament was engaged with a parliamentary debate, but in Ireland, they actually always set up a joint parliamentary committee of the two houses to consider the Assembly recommendations. And those assembly recommendations go to government alongside the committee report. So Parliament is tied into the process of review. The only downside of that is that Parliament can be a place where some of those recommendations get rejected very early on. So in Ireland, when they made recommendations on climate change, the farming lobby was very strong on getting the proposal for greenhouse gas taxes for farming to be removed. So it has pros and cons, but it's really clear process where the Parliament is very linked into the follow-up process. And in Luxembourg, on the call that we had last week, I thought the most interesting thing about that was that the Prime Minister actually appointed his chief of staff to run the sponsorship group, to run the cross-departmental team that would be responsible for taking forward the recommendations from the Assembly. So he was making the point that meant that different departments couldn't avoid their responsibilities. And he said whenever anyone said to him, we're already doing that, he would send somebody to check. And that's a really, really important power. And the other thing I think they've done is their internal reporting tool, which is an Excel sheet, which basically says where the different proposals are, is actually publicly available. So that is a document that you can actually see exactly where the different proposals sit and exactly what the government is doing, whether they've agreed to do something, whether they're modifying something, or whether they're abandoning something. So I think these are kind of two interesting developments that we might want to reflect on. So a couple of more slides, and then I'll be over. So clear takeaways from Scotland from these other examples. We've got to carefully consider how we integrate different actors into this process, whether they be politicians, whether they be public officials, whether it's Parliament, whether it's stakeholders, whether it's members of the Assembly. And we've got to figure out what the constellation of responsibilities and relationships is. And I think my really big take-home point is we need to spend as much time and energy on preparing an administration and other stakeholders to receive those recommendations as we do on preparing the Assembly. The sad thing is, though, the resources, generally the similar kind of resources aren't there. So just quickly, in terms of the kind of guidance, and if you've had a chance to read the briefing, that's great. If not, we're going to give each working group, each group the sort of rough guidelines that we've got at the moment is, first of all, we need, it's good if possible to time an Assembly with a policy cycle. That really helps. It isn't always the right thing to do. Sometimes we want to be running assemblies for different reasons, but if you want to have impact on a public administration, timing it right with the policy cycle is obviously a no-brainer. Secondly, you need to ensure that there is political support and dedicated time and resources to do the follow-up. Don't spend all your money on the Assembly. Make sure you've spent as much money and time on that follow-up process. And then clarifying responsibilities and structures and processes in timelines before the Assembly begins. And that includes a dedicated follow-up team, a sponsorship team, getting an internal reporting tool in place, perhaps making sure that your governance bodies remain in place like they did in Scotland, figuring out how you raise awareness across the authority that this is happening and it's going to land, figuring out how you're going to integrate the Parliament or at local level, the full council into the process, and then figuring out how you're going to do public reporting, whether in the short term and the long term. One of the things that's often been said to us is that short-term reporting is problematic because it takes a long time for the policy process to kick in. So I think we need to combine short-term reporting on what is the authority doing with longer-term reporting on what is that actually achieved. And then some other recommendations about capacity building for Assembly members. Additional Assembly weekend looks like a really good thing where they get to review what the government is up to. And then something which a number of people have suggested is creating an independent accountability board, some sort of board made up of stakeholders and citizens potentially. But that's a sort of, I'm not really quite clear how that would work, but it's an idea that's out there. So I think it's really, really helpful for it to be in our discussion. So some open questions, which I'm going to now ask to, I'm going to have to ask to Oliver and to Doreen. Is firstly, is the kind of guidance we're suggesting, the kinds of things I was just suggesting, is that the right sort of guidance, or what's missing? What other guidance should we have? So the document, I should say, someone's just said, where is the document? The briefing is on the website. You were sent it beforehand, and the last page of it is it has got the you can find it on the Knoca website under research as well, and also we'll be sharing it with during the breakout groups. So what can we reasonably expect about different actors, and then what can we do as a community of practice to actually ensure that follow-up is taken seriously, to ensure that follow-up is seen as a priority. So on that note, I will stop sharing. And hello, Doreen.
Hello.
You suddenly appeared as if by magic.
I appear from Brazil.
That's what I heard. That's what I heard. How was Brazil?
It actually was a really interesting discussion, very relevant to this. So
yeah, well, let's see what you can bring in. So I hope you caught some of it. I know Doreen was a bit late, and Oliver's been with us. So I'm going to start off by taking you close to home and asking you about the Scottish experience. So I gave a very short précis about what I saw happening in Scotland and what I thought worked well. So I'm kind of interested for your thoughts on what do you think Scotland got right, and what do you think could have been improved. So Oliver, if I start with you, what just a couple of, you know, what do you think that you did well in Scotland, and what would you, if you had your time again, what would you do differently?
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Great to be here. I think, I mean, the brief captures really well a lot of the things that that the Scottish Climate Assembly tried to do. I think I'm going to highlight two things that I think are really important. One of the reasons some of those innovations were included was thanks to the learning from the previous assembly that had happened in Scotland, where so many things went wrong, that there was so much learning that then could be incorporated. And the Climate Assembly organizers put a lot of time into talking to researchers like myself or Stephen Elstob and others who had been involved in the previous assembly, investigating the previous assembly, as well as with the organizers of the previous assembly. So learning from past experience, I don't know that we do that enough, and this is really important because a point I'm going to keep coming back to is the issue of context. Each public administration is different, and within each public administration there are multiple public administration cultures. Some of them coalesce and some of them collide, and and so you need to understand that context so that then you can navigate it. So learning from previous experiences, spending that time, and connected to that, I think it helped to think of the assembly in terms of 4 phases rather than the usual 2. Usually we think in terms of preparation and implementation, but I think here we were operating on the basis of 4 phases. Inception, which is when you work on the ground, you kind of lay the groundwork, and that has to do with building relationships, connecting to people who were involved in previous assemblies, learning about the political and policy context for the assembly that's to come, and all that kind of thing. So that's the inception stage. Then the preparation stage, which is the usual stuff that goes into putting together an assembly. Implementation, the assembly deliberating and working together. And then the 4th stage, which is the influence stage. And if you think in terms of those 4 stages, then you realize how important it is to connect the inception stage and the influence stage. And that's when you begin to think about structures and the key agents that need to be mobilized. So those are the 2 things that I'll highlight. Of course, then there is all the stuff that you have in the briefing, a dedicated team who fought a lot of battles backstage for things to happen. And then a lot of interesting things that were done afterwards, talking to lots of ministers, over 30 directorates in government, parliament, etc., the civic charter, the 8th weekend, all those kind of elements. But, the point you made about the policy cycle, I think is crucial here, because despite all the stuff that the Scottish Climate Assembly got right, the fact that it was delayed and therefore didn't overlap properly with the right policy cycle really undermined a lot of the potential for impact. So it just shows that it's not just a factor, it really can undermine the whole architecture that you build in terms of structures and agents.
Oh, that's really helpful, Oliver. I've got so much to respond, but I'll Doreen, does that ring true with you? And would you want to add anything, both in terms of success or challenge factors?
Absolutely rings true in all aspects. I guess there are a couple of real challenges that we faced. The idea to have an assembly on climate did not come from government; it came from Parliament, and I think taking very seriously who's responsible therefore actually is something we perhaps didn't do well enough at the beginning. So thinking about where the outcomes were going and where they were going to land. And I think
clarify on that. So the interesting thing here is sort of Parliament created a process where in fact a requirement by government to respond to that process.
So it was a requirement that went into our Climate Change Act. It was an addition when the government brought forward an act around climate action. The Parliament made an additional suggestion, and the suggestion was a requirement for the Citizen Assembly. So that's not necessarily bad or wrong. It's just, I think it's one of the factors that we need to look at where the influence sits and who owns it. And therefore how it impacts. One of the good things we did was involving children. Ministers and everybody else can't resist kids when they're talking to them. So not only was that a very effective bit of the whole way that the Assembly ran, but actually was also really useful in adding a really pertinent voice to the discussion that in most places isn't really heard. So I think that was a really important addition, and I absolutely agree with Oliver's sort of 4 phases. I think I would also add a little bit of long-termism, because people don't necessarily know where you are in the policy cycle. This is an incredibly complex area. There will be no government now that has not started thinking about it, even if what it's thinking is, oh shit, we don't know what to do. There is none that will not have started thinking about it. So you don't necessarily know where you are in that cycle, or that there's necessarily just one cycle. So just transition has its own process, and the other elements also. So there's adaptions work, there's energy work. So there are all sorts of places. But what we need really to do is see how this is affecting the overall work of government. I mean, it depends what the question you put to a citizen assembly is, but given our question was very specifically about how Scotland changes.
I'd like to pick this up because I think this is a really interesting challenge that Scotland threw up, and I just think Scotland got so much right in terms of making sure these spaces were in place. Just following up with what Oliver was saying, where lots of conversations were happening. Someone made this point in the chat about how important these conversations are happening, kind of like making it a administrative and stakeholder conversations going on, about it, bringing the citizens back in, having them as advocates. And I thought this was amazing. And then of course, after 6 months, formally, I'm saying formally, yeah, after 6 to 7 months, formally, none of those structures existed anymore.
Nope.
And it's almost like whereas most people fall off the cliff as soon as the recommendations arrive, you actually managed to keep that going for 6 months, which I think is remarkable. And I recognise that there are still resonances going out there, and we still see references to the Scottish Climate Assembly. That's not a question for me. But there must be something between that intense 6 months and then having nothing. And I just wonder what you, looking back at the Assembly, is there something? Obviously, you can't change the timing.
No, we couldn't change the timing. So I guess there's 2 things. One is in all of these kinds of assemblies, particularly around climate, the participants get incredibly into the issue. They really want to continue to be involved. That's really quite difficult for governments then to do, because because there isn't currently a mechanism to do it. We have seen, members of the Assembly going out and doing things on their own. I would like in the future to be able to think how better we can support participants with that transition. I don't have an answer right now. I'm sure Oliver has a better one. But it feels to me as if there is policymakers move around and move on quite quickly. So if this is going to continue to have impact, we can't expect Susie to be sat here because she now has, that team have moved on. But one of the things that we are trying to do is embed these processes in Scottish Government and create a team that has some of that race memory, which is really important. And if we're going to have the learning environment that Oliver said, one of the things that will do is have a consistent approach to research around methods and impact. So all of those things are kind of thought about. If somebody can give me just a couple of million, I'll be there.
Oliver, do you want to follow up on that? Because clearly this is one of the biggest challenges for these assemblies, which is that there is that danger of the drop-off. And you're someone who's been studying kind of like the relationship between democratic innovation, public administration, broader society, broader social processes. So I mean, I'm getting a bit sort of nerdy here about what sort of techniques and processes do we need to put in place. But I think we have to get down to that level. So how do you keep it over time when, as Doreen says, if you're successful running a climate assembly, you'll be told to go and work somewhere else to be a success over there. So how do you keep that going? How do you keep it?
So this is where some of the fundamental clashes between those different logics that Julia Molinengo and colleagues point out. And there's a paper as well by Ricky Dean that is really good on the public administration side of things. I really recommend that. So here's the thing, right? I don't think there is a universal approach that is going to be applicable across all the different contexts in which climate assemblies are taking place. Because in Scotland, there were a lot of the right ingredients laid out for the post-assembly phase. The Secretariat, or at least a core group, as well as the stewarding group and others, remain engaged for well over a year after the assembly concluded, and it wasn't enough because these things are not enough and the structures are not enough, as important as they are. You also need the internal activism, people within the administration, some people call them intrapreneurs or boundary spanners, all kinds of policy workers who then carry things through and become internal activists within the administration. And then in terms of the length of this, of the aftermath, in some contexts, 6 months might be enough because there is a policy cycle that is very well defined on a very specific question. In other cases, I know the guide recommends 2 years. In other cases, 2 years might be right. And in other cases, 5-10 years might be right, because some assemblies are agenda-setting assemblies on multiple issues. And for those, you really need a decade really to track and put things in place to track. But there's something really important that I think the field of deliberative democracy has not paid enough attention to, which is, and this is well-known material from critical policy studies and public governance studies, to understand the public administration. I mean, there's a part of public administration that is organized in bureaucratic terms, as you would expect from a textbook, but that's just a part of it. A lot of the public administration work is chaotic, serendipitous, opportunistic, and you need to understand how to navigate that so that you can take up those windows of opportunity. And that's where internal activists, entrepreneurs, boundary spanners, and political champions need to come in. So this is very tricky because on the political side, for example, unless the political life of representatives depends in some way on the success of a climate assembly, they're not going to pay that much attention to it because there are so many other demands on them and their time. So context is everything, I think. And I think we need to start paying far more attention to understanding that different administrations have different administrative cultures, and that the same public administration will have multiple cultures within. Let me give you an example. Many years ago, I did an ethnography of a particular public administration, and I was sitting in this department next to a different department. One of the departments was measuring success by virtue of how many evictions they could make. It was the housing department, and evictions were important. They were not doing well, and they thought they had to do more evictions. Now, next door was the social services department, measuring success by virtue of avoiding homelessness, right? So there you had two different departments, same administration, working at cross purposes. Now, the Environment Directorate in the Scottish Government had multiple different groupings and tribes and networks and priorities. So even just within one part of that public administration, there were different logics at play. So this is just we need to get wiser at understanding that there are all these nuances and all these different, the policy cycle. Earlier we mentioned the policy cycle, but I think it's important to note that there are multiple policy cycles, and they look nothing
circular either. They're all over the place. Yeah.
In the Scottish case, though, there was one specific policy cycle in the Environment Directorate that was really relevant to this. And that was the sort of the master policy cycle, so to speak. And then there will be multiple other policy cycles in other departments that then will own the implications of different recommendations. But unless we begin to understand this multiplicity of networks, workers, agents, and circumstances, we will remain puzzled by why these assemblies are not landing better.
So this is interesting, Oliver, and I'll bring Doreen in as well. So I really recognise your argument about being context dependent, and that, so much matters there. But the knowledge network is a knowledge network and needs to sort of pass. So it's not enough for me to say, Oliver, it's going to be different where you are, so I can't tell you anything. What is it? What is it? Sort of what are the sorts of recommendations we should be giving people in order that they? I mean, I think your story is really important there about, being able to clarify to people that so many people think a public administration is one thing. I mean, that's really clearly absurd.
But there are implications, and I know Doreen will want to come in here, but I'll just give you a few practical implications. First of all, and these are, I think, generalizable. I think these are lessons that can be taken into different contexts. The first one is to do some really, really careful critical context analysis early on. That's something that organizers should do by default. And trying to map the range of actors, the range of priorities, agendas, and cultures at play within the administration and the multiple networks because again, policy making is not just the business of the state. There are multiple actors across civil society, across the private sector, etc., involved in policy making all the time. The second is to pay more attention to policy brokers and political champions and understanding what kind of agency is going to be required. What does that mean in that particular context? Then it's about trying to put together, there are things that we had the aspiration, and Assembly members proposed this as well, to have some kind of monitoring going on afterwards by the citizens themselves. And I think there's a strong case for a citizen monitoring body. Some of us even proposed a state of the climate statement to be given every year in Parliament, which would include not just elements of the Assembly and the follow-up to the recommendations, but environmental policy more broadly. But something like that can create a point of visibility and pressure as well. Then I think there's a lot to be done in terms of training and supporting Assembly members in the aftermath to play that role, probably, or perhaps in collaboration with some members of the stewarding group, of the expert groups, etc. And then I think, in some ways, there is something here as well about trying to build an architecture of incentives that makes it irresistible to follow up, monitor, and account for what's going on. And that will look differently in different places, but thinking about that architecture of incentives, which combines both structures and agents, I think is the key here. And this is all good old-fashioned political work. In many ways, what we need to do is to connect more clearly with public policy scholars, with critical policy scholars, with public governance scholars, and we need to bridge that space of research and practice between the field of deliberative democracy and the field of public governance.
Okay, so I'll just pass over to Doreen in just a second, because what's interesting about that, just to give you an example on the incentive structure one, it's really interesting in Luxembourg. that they had the chief of staff who was leading that, which meant suddenly the incentives changed for everybody in the organisation because it was the Prime Minister's chief of staff who they had to answer to. So that was a really interesting example of how that, a real world example.
Much like art in Dublin as well,
yeah.
Because it was sat in Taoiseach's office. Very straightforwardly, that's how they got the authority to do it. I think there's a couple of things.
Sorry, just for people who don't know, so that's the Irish Climate Assembly.
I beg your pardon, yeah.
Secretariat is based in the Prime Minister's office, isn't it?
Yes. And that is a real incentive within government. I think there's a couple of things here. One is for us as a group of practitioners ourselves, there were a bugger of a lot of recommendations from that assembly. Expecting a policy team to work their way through 90 recommendations is actually a really big ask. So being really clear about how you refine the recommendations and have them so that there is a kind of relevance. There is also a tension here. And there's a tension about making sure that your assembly is not co-opted by government, so that it's not seen as government trying to deliver the output it first started with. So the involvement of people from the policy area is not usually close, and our evidence for our climate assembly was very clearly independent. It was very clearly run by an evidence team that I think was really, really important. But there does then give you a tension that they're not working hand in glove with the people within government who are at the same time developing this stuff within their own cycle. So I think we need to be a bit smarter about how we maintain that independence, because it is hugely important, but that we don't pretend government isn't already doing stuff. And that's a really important element, I think.
Okay, so my last question for you both, because this is, I could just talk to you both for the rest of this 2 hours, but I think that would be really unfair. Is as a community of practice, what do you think we, as people interested in this, people working in public, whether they're public officials, whether they're academics, whether they're practitioners who deliver these things, what do you think we can do as a community of practice to actually have more attention focused on this particular set of issues? Because it strikes me that if we don't do more work in this area, if we don't have it more prioritized, then assemblies will always disappoint, and that there will always be this point of this despair as people throw their hands in the air and say this didn't land. So what can we as a community do? Is it about how these things are commissioned? Is it about advice we provide? Is it about some activism? I'm really interested in what you think. Doreen, do you want to start, or are you looking at all of this?
I think there's not one silver bullet, and there's not one thing that will get action. One of the things that we thought was quite helpful when we set up the stewarding group for our climate assembly was making sure we had cross-party support. So almost all the parties who operate in Scotland were part of that group, with one obvious exception. But I think that really mattered. It was a really helpful thing to do. If I'm honest, has that gone on and helped us, that the climate committee have come back to this? No. So that needs to be maintained, that action around there being a really useful link back into wherever the commissioning came from. And in our instance, it was Parliament.
So for us as a community of practice, we've got to do more political work, basically.
I think that's absolutely right. And more, if you want your citizen assembly to land with government, you have to work with government. I mean, some of them will, of course, be local communities that just want to sort their way through how they adapt. But if you want it to land with government, there has to be action that government can deal with. So not shouting at us, not getting angry and stamping your tiny feet, but making that a real conversation around So these things are raising and keeping that awareness of the citizen assembly going within government. And to a degree, that was up to me and others during our climate assembly. It wasn't easy, and it continues to be a bit of a challenge. But I think that is a real key.
Do you have any thoughts, Oliver? Was it what
Yep.
we community of practice can do?
Yeah, so two quick thoughts on that, and then one final quick thought on a broader point here. So practical points. I mean, we just need to, if you look at the field of deliberative democracy, especially climate assemblies in the last few years, it's been the case that it's been expanding from a circle of those interested to then overlapping, ever expanding concentric circles of other communities of practice. We just need to keep doing that with communities of practice like policy scholars, policy practitioners, people who understand policy work. And that's not just people working for the state. That's also people working outside the state doing policy work. So those connections and connecting to good old-fashioned stuff that we already know quite well. There's a wealth of evidence about the messiness of policymaking, about the chaotic nature of bureaucratic practice. All the, we seem to still operate often in this field with a very simplistic notion that is an input-output type of black box. You input things into the bureaucracy and things come at the other end and things happen. We know that's not the case. So we need to understand that better, and that means bringing into the community of practice people who understand the beautiful mess that is policy work and policy spaces. Then the second point, just on the guidance, on this briefing itself, I think the guidance is a really good starting point. I suspect it's going to be a live document. So now we need to see how these different elements and proposals interact with the specific contexts. So I think that's going to be really useful, coming back to it over time, fairly regularly, maybe once a year, and just revising it and see what we have learned now that perhaps we're starting to pay more attention to the landing and to the public administration side of things. And then my final point is the point as well that I think the field is also ready to start realizing that the business of policy and policy making goes well beyond the state. We are putting all our emphasis on the state as the landing place for recommendations from climate assemblies. We need to take more seriously the role of the commons and, a commons-based economy, the role of all kinds of networks and spaces that are out there rewiring our economies from the local to the transnational level. So we need to pay more attention to that political economy. Because the state, let me put it this way, right? The current assumption is that it's all about having better inputs into the system, right? Assemblies will produce better inputs into the system, but that's not changing the system, right? Yeah. That system is still the same. That's still the same bureaucracy, it's still the same policy networks, it's still the same setup of governance. So, you might say, well, the climate assembly itself is the change. Yeah, fine, but that doesn't change the apparatus of the state that is meant to act on it. It's still a non-deliberative state, on a pro-capital biased state. That's still there. That's not being changed by the climate assembly, and that's the landing place. So we're focusing a lot on the input side, not enough on the output. Too much on the legitimacy side. Let's make better decisions to lead to better outcomes. Too little on the capacity side. How do we make this happen? How do we take forward these things? And for that, it cannot just be the state. It's going to have to be an alliance between an enabling state and a more commons-based economy. That's my personal take. It's about expanding the range of actors and landing places. And that in itself, I think, is going to create a different architecture of incentives and accountability.
Thanks.
It's an art, not a science.
Well, you make that point well. It was really hard enough just thinking about the administration, not thinking about the commons and various other states. But yeah, your point is taken incredibly well. Look, Doreen, Oliver, you've really given us so much to think about. What we're going to do is we're going to break out into groups to replicate this conversation, look at this question about what kind of guidance we should be providing, and also this question about what we should do as a community. Okay, so I'm going to try and get feedback from the groups. If the people feedbacking could just be really quick and concise, that will be really helpful. From my group, Elise, are you happy to just kind of mention 2 or 3 really key points that you think are really important?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to be brief. So as you said, like a lot of things were said, but I think we really insisted on the need for critical context analysis. So prior to the start of the process, anticipation is key. Knowing the actors involved really well, and then another few key examples. Give concrete examples. Actually, there was one. Define an output that will be concretely then integrated for the administration. And then another point that was interesting was beyond the recommendations, try to set milestones, but also motivating statement that can be encouraging for policymakers afterwards to want to keep the work. Voilà. I can stop here.
That was really quick. Okay. I think the point you were making, actually, I thought was really. I was in this group, which was that someone was saying they found the case studies really useful, and actually, the more case studies we have, the more it would speak to your particular situation, and that, you know, we have lots of case studies of climate assemblies or different assemblies all over the world. We don't have many case studies of what happened afterwards, and that's actually can be quite inspiring and can be quite useful in terms of learning what works well and what doesn't. So that's really great. That's really helpful. Group 2, I'm not sure whose group that was. It's Doreen, you're doing the...
it's mine, and Marin was going to feedback.
Yeah, I don't know if I can summarize everything, so I've asked the group to just chip in after. Yeah, I think some of the suggestions were that there could be different criteria to be for feedback to be given, and an example was given from Denmark, which I can't now translate, so I might ask Annika to translate it later. There were some I think also a request for case studies. So there was a request, for example, of have there been citizen assemblies with binding obligations, and how did they do that? Exploring ways of connecting recommendations with decision-making structures, which could potentially involve opening it up to wider groups. Yeah, the combination of referenda, we didn't really have time to go into why in Ireland, for example, that had to be done. But yeah, so that was another suggestion, although I think everyone based in the UK is sort of reluctant to go down that route. But yeah, there was also the aspect of the value of feelings and emotions. So can recommendations be more about values rather than specific concrete solutions, so that we value fairness, so that a solution has to be fair, and that sort of thing. So could there be more guidance on that? I think that's that one. Yeah, the roles of different actors in the process, and also that it feels a lot like the follow-up sounds like this is something to be done at the end, but actually feels like this is something that needs to start happening already before the assembly even takes place. So creating these relationships with civil servants, with politicians, that this is really done well in advance, that those relationships also inform when the assembly should take place, so that we're really informed about when the cycles are. And then I think my own personal thing that I would like more guidance on is, you know, who would actually be that group. So it wouldn't necessarily be the group delivering or organizing the citizens assembly, but it would be sort of a different group, and how would that work? And yeah, I think we all agree case studies is probably the best way of learning. So yes, any case studies would be greatly appreciated. And I don't know if I left things out, so I'm just saying, my group, feel free to come in.
Ellen, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to also add in that there's probably a good mechanism for keeping basically for tracking what kind of citizens assembly people are putting on by us setting the standard, by us saying category A plus star is with a commitment political to see this through to the end, to deal with all the recommendations, and will only be disbanded when everybody agrees, da da da. The next tier down is, or we're doing all of this and then we'll hand it to our political mechanisms. Another tier down is, we have done a citizens assembly, we've asked people's opinions, we got pats for being democratic, but we're not really going to do anything. And just categorize the type of citizens assemblies we have from this point onwards. Just make it formal. That way politicians need to live up to certain standards and need to answer for why the recommendations aren't being implemented in the most democratic possible way.
Okay, gosh, that's a very specific. I mean, in a sense, that's what we're doing with. We're not doing your categorization, you say, but we're trying to make it clear with some of this guidance that actually this is what should be expected, you know, and kind of like. But I think that's really.
I think it would be valuable to have an international standard and just decide to set it. Otherwise, other people will set it for us. Make it tough, make it firm, and just be like, okay, you can have citizens assemblies. It's great and valuable, whatever you do, but this is the gold standard now, and we're setting it. And if they don't live up to it, do that.
No, it's good, because OECD's guidance actually is quite weak. It's quite weak in this area, actually, and it's something which we should do more. Fantastic, thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Marin. Who was speaking from Oliver's group, from the third group?
I think I made a couple of notes, so I'll share those, and then if others in the group want to come in, I would appreciate that. I should say first that my group was very good at writing in the document itself, so we have material there to digest and chew over, including some very specific practical recommendations and notes. So I won't go over those, but those are there. We had a wide-ranging conversation. There were a few headlines for me. One of them is the fundamental question of what does a good landing look like, right? Because that's going to be different depending on the context, the purpose, and we were wondering if sometimes there are too high expectations, you know, and that's why, you know, sometimes it's a bit of a frustrating process because there's a misalignment between the expectations of different actors. So defining what a good landing looks like for a specific assembly, that's a challenge for that kind of early critical analysis of the inception stage. Then a second point, we were talking a little bit about the division of labor, the division of democratic labor, as in, well, if climate assemblies, are climate assemblies those that are empowered by politicians, so with the support of politicians, climate assemblies take place, and therefore in theory, politicians are elected politicians in ministerial positions are expected to then direct bureaucracies and public administration to make things happen, right? So that's one thing, but sometimes when we're talking, it looks like climate assemblies are a way of bypassing politicians, and therefore a direct connection to the bureaucracy, the public administration itself. And depending on how you take on that dual way of thinking about it, then there are different implications for that landing. Then a third point, well, and of course that point is the classic debate in this space about the clashes between representative, deliberative, and participatory forms of democracy. A third point was about the role of broader public engagement and consultation and broader public deliberation in the public sphere. Because we've been focusing a lot on landing in the public administration and the internal dynamics and the dynamics between these actors, institutions. But actually, if we take it a level up and we think about the public sphere as a whole, and the broader public is involved, since early on, since the inception stage, that surely has to be part of the architecture of incentives that then puts pressure on public administrations to do what they need to do. And just a final point to highlight, a lot of these points connect to the purpose of the assembly itself. And of course, Knoca has already published some really good work on this, and other people like Janusz Pfeffer, who's here, and others are thinking very carefully about the different functions and agendas of assemblies. But it really has implications for the landing in public administration, because an agenda-setting assembly or an ideation assembly then will require broader public engagement, consultation, all kinds of things before landing in specific policy spaces. Whereas an assembly that is oriented towards rendering a public judgment or resolving a dilemma or taking on something more specific, then that seems more policy ready. So again, context and contingency really matters in this analysis. I'm going to stop there.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Oliver. And then the last group, Mark, did you find someone, or are you doing it yourself?
I think I'll be doing it myself. I didn't manage to convince anyone, though I tried, I should say.
You are charmed. You see, I couldn't imagine that your charm didn't work, but there we go.
Well, there we have it. Well, let me give it a go, and maybe someone will want to add a word or two. So first thought is I'm always very happy to be in these breakout rooms. We had a super engaged conversation, and it's really impressive the amount of perspectives and experience in the room for these talks. So we actually started on I wouldn't call it a pessimistic note, but let's put it this way, a critical perspective on this, because Jakob started by asking what's actually the relevance of doing processes if it isn't very clear what the need is, and should we be asking those questions more clearly? Is there really a need for this process? Does it fit into a cycle? And do the recommendations lead somewhere or fit into something meaningful? And perhaps if they don't, should we then not host these assemblies? And it was kind of backed up in the conversation in a few ways. Katie from Extinction Rebellion was critical towards the fact that politicians often have to, well, they have power, but are they willing to share it? Was a question. Because essentially, at least for a lot of these processes, there is an element of having to give some authority away to assemblies. So Elisa had, and I'm mentioning the names, hopefully I'm referring this properly. Elisa mentioned the fact that it actually is interesting to ask the question, how do we make the arguments for what makes it relevant for politicians to do this? So she used some Italian examples of places where there had been assemblies done locally, but mostly because there was a certain fertile ground already in the administration for this kind of participation. But what about all the places where that isn't the case? And it led to the question of, well, what if an assembly becomes somewhat of a fake process? Like, should we be wary of that if assemblies are somehow done not with the full ability to influence something because they were never given the right opportunities in the design and in the commissioning? And so these were the critical processes. I think it's important to say, though, that we also had this general underlying thought that doing deliberative processes does really make sense. Jakob also stated that maybe it's okay that we're still capacity building, maybe it's okay that we're still learning or supporting administrations in learning how these different types of processes fit into the larger picture. And we kind of finished on a note by Eli on perhaps Knoca and other relevant actors, perhaps, and this is me as a Knoca member saying perhaps more emphasis on other relevant actors should be putting more attention on training on these aspects, because there's so much about how this very, very complex field of politics functions that it's perhaps also something that'll just need a lot more practice and training. And
that's really helpful. And I think your point, Mark, about inverted commas sham processes, in a funny kind of way, I think what we're trying to do with this guidance is to say, this is what you need to do, and if you're not doing it, we don't think you're doing a good process. So I mean, there's a kind of calling people out by saying these are the sorts of processes we should be running. Ellie, did you want to add something? We're coming towards the end of the session, but please do throw something in.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Yeah, just to add what Mark said about my kind of recommendation at the end about trainings, just say specifically trainings for politicians and civil servants. For instance, I know UK 100, which is kind of like a knowledge network on climate action. They'll do like a weekend like training camp for like councillors on how to actually get climate action implemented in their council. So if Knoca or whoever could do similar things on, going through the briefing, going through the guidance that you're producing on how to have a successful post-assembly period, I think that's a practical solution that could help.
We are running with V-Day spring schools on climate. So there's only like 60 people at a time, if you know what I mean. But it's scratching a surface, I guess. But that's really helpful. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, everybody. That was really amazing. Oliver, I just wanted to invite Oliver and And who was the other one? Who's the woman? Doreen, that's her name. I should just say Doreen is a
How
very
can
good
you forget Doreen?
I know Doreen's a really good friend of mine. How could I possibly forget her name? I don't know. This is my, can I just say, this is my 6th hour of Zoom today. So
yeah,
maybe
me too.
Yeah. And it's what I've got Zoom brain. Oliver's got baby brain. We've got Zoom brain. So, any final thoughts on what we as a community should be doing in this space? Would be really, not that I'm looking for final wise words necessarily, but is there anything that you'd like to are there any thoughts that you'd like to leave this session with? So Doreen, do you want to go first? Is there anything that's really captured, something that's really captured you during this session?
So I guess my abiding worry about all of this is that we talk to ourselves. So I love the guidance that Knoca's putting out, but there is a real risk that we struggle to get that broader take up with a wider constituency, be it civil servants, be it politicians, be it other civil society organisations. So I guess for me, having just come back from Estonia, where the Open Government Summit was, I've been trying very hard with Open Government to have that broader conversation about this needs to slot into what you do. And I think there's something about how we all go back to our networks and make this a bigger conversation than one that we always enjoy when we're talking to ourselves. But I think it's really important that some of the really clear guidance that Knoca is coming up with doesn't just work for climate assemblies. It is a much clearer way of thinking about that deliberative set of processes. If we are going to shift power, we need to have ways of doing that isn't going to scare the horses at the very beginning. So it's about finding routes through that will give us a much clearer set of processes for climate, but for all of the other things as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, in many ways, the kind of guidance we're doing is not climate specific. I mean, we're talking about on this particular thing, but you're quite right. And I completely take your point. Oliver, any thoughts?
Yeah, 3 quick points.
You're an academic. There always has to be 3 points.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
Yeah, it's, I'm odd numbers. You know, my daughter was born on the 15th. I was really happy because she was born 6 minutes after midnight, so at 12:06, and we were wondering, is it going to be the 14th or the 15th? Anyway, so first on the question of power that someone mentioned, I think this is the fundamental question for the landing in public administration and for the impact and influence more broadly. And part of what we need to do as a community of practice and research is to push back against the notion that power sharing needs to be based on a zero-sum game. And get back to the good old-fashioned participatory understanding of power that says that by sharing power, sometimes you generate power that wasn't there. So often my first conversation with politicians, ministers, etc., is to try and make them visualize how by unlocking capacity through democratic innovations can generate power to do things they couldn't do otherwise. And so I think we need to push that a bit more. The second point is just, I suppose, a general plea. I begin to see a lot of impatience. You know, people come into this field, there's some frustration, but we need to realize that these are very early days. You know, climate assemblies are 5, 6, 7 years old. Yeah. Many publics, larger citizens' assemblies just around 20 years old. Soon we will mark the 20-year anniversary. So this is all very new, and I'm a little bit suspicious of that impatience, especially from people who have cut a lot of slack to electoral forms of democracy that have been imperfect for decades, if not centuries, in some places. So why are we so in such a rush to? So this is just to say that climate assemblies are new interventions in very problematic spaces. And reality is now speaking back. We're doing these interventions and then different realities are speaking back. We need to learn from that and have the wisdom to continue learning and acting. And my final point is just to really recommend that people take this briefing and read it and share it widely. You know, it appeals to a very wide demographic. Last night I read it to my 15 days old daughter, and it had a very good... It had a very good soothing effect. For me, it was stimulating. For her, it was calming. So I highly recommend it.
She put a thumb mark on it as endorsed by.
Yeah, it has Molly's endorsement.
That is brilliant. That's really fun. So there was a guy, there's a someone in our working group from who was from Stuttgart administration, was talking about how useful he found it. But you know, your 15-week-old baby, I think that, you know, that's really quite something. I'll take that back to ECF as impact, definitely. Look, I just want to thank Doreen and Oliver, because they're always, without question, are always so generous with their thoughts and ideas, and so open in their thinking. And it's that sort of thing that's going to help take this work forward. Although, as I understand, Doreen, we've got to go and talk to people we wouldn't normally talk to, not just ourselves. I completely understand that. But if I'm allowed to talk to you two occasionally, that will make my life a better life. So thank you both for that. And I just want to thank everybody for taking this workshop really seriously. We're going to hopefully within the next 2 to 3 weeks, we'll finalize the briefing. It won't appeal to everything, but as everybody, we won't be able to integrate everything. But as Oliver says, this is a process, and you know, we will hopefully revise it as we go on. And just as ever, I'd like to thank you for just being such an active group of people who are so interested in engaging on this. It just makes it so much more worthwhile. I always have to end with a couple of adverts. We have our next event is a learning call, where we're going to be looking at the People's Plan for Nature in the UK. And what was really interesting about the People's Assembly for Nature, which was a citizens' assembly it was commissioned by 3 civil society organisations. It was commissioned by the RSPB, World Wildlife Fund, and National Trust. And so this is a very different model from the sort of government organised, government commission initiatives or activities. So I think one of the real questions for us is, you know, when we think about deliberative processes, why do we always think about them being linked to government? Is there there's a really interesting opportunity here to potentially link up with civil society campaigning as well. So that's happening in October 11th. And this isn't in our diary yet. It's not in our official diary, but on October the 31st, so you can pencil it in because you're so interested in this stuff. We're running a workshop with FIDE on the question of permanent climate assemblies. And we're going to be looking at what's happened in Belgium, in Brussels, and in Milan, and probably a couple of other cities as well. And we're looking at that question of, are permanent assemblies always a good idea? And if they are, how should they operate? So for those of us who are interested in questions of follow-up, obviously these questions of permanency and institutionalization are really key to that as well. Yeah. So hopefully this is going to be a conversation we carry on. Well, of course, it's going to be a conversation we carry on over the next few months. So it's been such a pleasure. Thank you all for spending a couple of hours with us, and I wish you well till next time we meet. Take care, everybody.